The rain fell like frozen needles that November evening, turning the city streets into rivers of despair. Marina clutched her 3-year-old son Liam tighter against her chest as she stood beneath the flickering bus shelter, her red dress soaked through, clinging to her trembling body like a second skin. The expensive fabric that once made her feel beautiful now mocked her circumstances, a remnant of a life that had shattered just 48 hours ago. Her makeup ran in dark streams down her cheeks, mixing with tears she could no longer hold back. Liam's teddy bear dangled from his small hand, as wet and defeated as everything else in their world. She had been standing there for 2 hours, watching cars pass by, their headlights briefly illuminating her desperate situation before disappearing into the night. Her phone was dead, her wallet empty except for a photograph of happier times, and her heart felt like it might stop beating altogether. When she saw the sleek black Mercedes approaching, something inside her broke completely. This was her last chance. Without thinking, without pride, without anything left to lose, Marina stepped into the rain-soaked street and raised her trembling hand, her voice cracking as she screamed the words that would change everything. "Help me, I have nowhere to go," she begged, her voice barely audible over the sound of rain hitting concrete. The millionaire businessman Alexander Chin had been driving home after closing the biggest deal of his career, his mind occupied with profit margins and acquisition strategies, when he saw her. His first instinct was to drive around the desperate woman standing in the middle of the road, but something about the small child in her arms made his foot hit the brake instead of the accelerator. The car stopped just inches from where Marina stood, her wet hair plastered to her face, her eyes wild with a mixture of fear and hope that Alexander had never seen in any boardroom negotiation. He sat there for a moment, his hands gripping the leather steering wheel, his rational mind telling him to drive away, to not get involved, to protect himself from whatever complicated situation this clearly was. But then Liam looked directly at him through the windshield, those enormous eyes filled with confusion and cold, and Alexander felt something shift inside his chest, something he thought had died years ago when his own childhood had been stolen by circumstances beyond his control. If you believe in kindness and second chances, if you think that one moment of compassion can change a life forever, please take a second to like this video, comment your thoughts, share this story, and subscribe to Acts That Matter. Your support helps us share more stories that remind us what it means to be human. Alexander opened his car door and stepped into the rain, his $1,000 suit immediately soaking through, but he barely noticed. Up close, Marina looked even more desperate, her body shaking so violently that he worried she might collapse right there on the wet pavement. The child in her arms was crying softly, his small face buried in his mother's neck, and Alexander could see that the boy was wearing only a light jacket that offered no protection against the November cold. Marina tried to speak, to explain, to justify why she had thrown herself in front of a stranger's car, but the words came out in broken fragments that made no sense. Alexander raised his hand gently, not wanting to startle her, and simply said to get in the car, they could talk where it was warm. The relief that flooded Marina's face was so profound that Alexander felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. She hesitated only for a second, that last remnant of self-preservation warning her about getting into cars with strangers, but when Liam began to cough, a wet, rattling sound that spoke of developing illness, she climbed into the passenger seat without another word. The interior of the Mercedes was warm and dry, smelling of expensive leather and subtle cologne, a stark contrast to the cold rain outside. Alexander turned up the heat and handed Marina his jacket from the back seat, watching as she wrapped it around Liam with the fierce protectiveness of a mother who had nothing left to give but love. For several minutes, neither of them spoke, the only sound being the rain hammering on the roof and Liam's occasional cough. Alexander wasn't sure what to say, how to ask the obvious questions without seeming judgmental, so he simply started driving, not toward his penthouse apartment but toward the 24-hour diner he had passed 1,000 times but never once entered. Marina stared out the window, watching the city lights blur through her tears, wondering if the stranger would take them somewhere safe or if this was just another chapter in the nightmare her life had become. She wanted to explain everything, to make him understand that she wasn't always like this, standing in the rain begging strangers for help, but shame kept her silent. At the diner, Alexander ordered hot soup, coffee, and chocolate milk for the boy, watching as Marina fed Liam with hands that shook from more than just cold. The child ate hungrily, desperately, in a way that suggested he hadn't had a proper meal in days, and Alexander felt anger rising in his chest, though he wasn't sure at whom it should be directed. Finally, when Liam had eaten enough to fall asleep against his mother's shoulder, Marina began to talk. Her story spilled out in a rush of words that had been building behind a dam of pride for too long. She had been a dancer at an upscale club, not something she was proud of but something that paid the bills after Liam's father had disappeared when she was 6 months pregnant. She had worked hard, saved money, dreamed of opening a small dance studio where she could teach children instead of performing for men with hungry eyes and empty promises. But 2 days ago, her landlord had sold the building without warning, and the new owner had given all tenants 48 hours to vacate. She had nowhere to go, no family to turn to, no friends who could take in a single mother and her young son. Her savings, which should have been enough for a security deposit on a new apartment, had been stolen from her locker at work by someone she thought was a friend. Alexander listened without interrupting, his face carefully neutral, but inside he was remembering another time, another rainy night, another desperate woman holding a child. He was remembering his own mother, who had worked 3 jobs to keep him fed, who had sacrificed everything so he could have opportunities she never had, who had stood in the rain more times than he could count because they couldn't afford a car or even bus fare some months. He remembered being that small boy, cold and scared, watching his mother's strength slowly erode under the weight of impossible circumstances. He had sworn when he made his first million that he would never forget where he came from, that he would help others who found themselves in similar situations, but somewhere along the way, success had insulated him from the reality of struggle. He had written checks to charities, attended fundraising galas, convinced himself he was making a difference, but he hadn't actually looked into the eyes of desperation in years. Until tonight. Until Marina and Liam had forced him to remember what it felt like to have nowhere to go and no one to turn to. When Marina finished her story, she waited for judgment, for the inevitable lecture about better choices and personal responsibility that people love to deliver when they had never experienced true desperation. Instead, Alexander pulled out his phone and made a call. Marina watched in confusion as he spoke quietly to someone on the other end, giving an address she didn't recognize, making arrangements that seemed impossibly generous. He owned several properties throughout the city, investment properties that he rented out for passive income, and one of them, a small 2-bedroom apartment in a safe neighborhood, had just become vacant last week. He told Marina she could stay there, rent-free for 3 months, which would give her time to find work and save enough for a proper start. He would also arrange for Liam to be enrolled in a good daycare program, something with sliding scale fees based on income, so Marina could work without worrying about her son. But there was one condition, he said, and Marina's heart sank, waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the real cost of this generosity to be revealed. The condition was that she had to promise to help someone else when she was back on her feet, to pay forward the kindness she was receiving tonight, to remember what it felt like to have nowhere to go and to never let someone else feel that alone if she had the power to help. The tears that Marina cried then were different from the ones she had shed in the rain. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a burden being lifted that she had carried for so long she forgot what it felt like to stand up straight. Alexander drove them to the apartment that night, stopping first at a 24-hour store to buy basics like towels, sheets, and groceries, refusing to let Marina feel like she was taking charity by insisting that the apartment came furnished and stocked for all tenants. The apartment was small but clean, with large windows that would let in morning light and a kitchen that smelled faintly of lemon cleaning solution. Liam woke up briefly when they arrived, looked around at the new space with sleepy confusion, and asked his mother if this was their new home. When Marina nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat, Liam smiled and said it was nice, much better than the bus stop. Alexander left them that night with his business card, his personal cell phone number written on the back, and a promise that he would check in tomorrow to make sure they had everything they needed. Over the following months, Alexander watched Marina transform. He stopped by occasionally, always with some excuse about checking on the property or dropping off something he claimed he didn't need, but really just to see how they were doing. Marina found work at a dance studio, teaching children's ballet classes, something that made her eyes light up in a way Alexander had never seen that first desperate night. She was good with the kids, patient and encouraging, and word spread quickly about the talented new instructor who treated every child like they were destined for greatness. Liam thrived in daycare, making friends and learning his letters, his cough disappearing once he had regular meals and a warm place to sleep. Marina saved every penny she could, living frugally despite having some breathing room, determined to be independent again as quickly as possible. She also started volunteering at a women's shelter on weekends, teaching free dance classes to women and children who were experiencing homelessness, paying forward the kindness that had saved her life just as Alexander had asked. On the evening of the 3rd month, Marina invited Alexander to the apartment for dinner. She had cooked a simple meal, nothing fancy, but she had set the table carefully and Liam had drawn a picture of Alexander as a thank you gift, a child's drawing that showed a tall man with a kind smile standing next to a car in the rain. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Marina's dance studio, casting long golden shadows across the polished wooden floors where dozens of small feet had learned to find their rhythm over the past 3 years. Marina stood at the mirror adjusting her hair into the tight bun she wore for teaching, watching her reflection with eyes that still sometimes couldn't believe the woman staring back was really her. The desperate mother in the soaked red dress felt like another person entirely, a ghost from a life she had survived rather than lived. But some mornings, when the light hit a certain way or when rain began to fall unexpectedly, she could feel that woman's fear creeping back into her chest, reminding her how fragile stability could be, how quickly everything could unravel if you stopped paying attention. She shook off the feeling as she had learned to do, focusing instead on the class schedule posted on the wall, the roster of students whose names she had memorized along with their dreams and struggles, the careful architecture of the life she had built from absolute nothing. Liam burst through the studio door with the boundless energy of an 8-year-old who had just been dropped off by Alexander after their Saturday morning ritual of pancakes and car talk. The boy's face was flushed with excitement, his backpack bouncing against his shoulders as he ran toward his mother, already talking before he reached her about the new electric car prototype Alexander had told him about and how the regenerative braking system worked. Marina smiled and caught her son in a hug, breathing in the scent of maple syrup that still clung to his hair, grateful beyond words that Liam's childhood memories were being filled with pancakes and engineering discussions rather than cold bus stops and hunger. Alexander followed more slowly, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the casual weekend clothes that made him look younger, more approachable, less like the intimidating businessman whose face occasionally appeared in financial magazines and more like the friend he had genuinely become. He handed Marina her coffee exactly as she liked it, with just enough cream to turn it caramel-colored, a small detail he had memorized along with countless others over the years of showing up consistently for the people he had decided to care about. Before Marina could thank him, her phone rang with an unknown number, and something about the way it sounded made her hesitate before answering. The voice on the other end belonged to a social worker named Patricia Chen, and Marina's heart immediately began to race because social workers in her experience meant trouble, meant someone questioning whether she was fit to raise her son, meant the possibility of losing everything she had fought so hard to build. But Patricia's voice was kind as she explained that she wasn't calling about Liam at all, but rather about Marina's sister Elena, a name that hit Marina like a physical blow. She hadn't spoken to Elena in almost 6 years, not since a terrible argument that had ended with both sisters saying unforgivable things, with Elena choosing her abusive boyfriend over her family, with Marina walking away because watching her sister self-destruct was too painful to bear. Patricia explained that Elena had been found 3 days ago in a hospital emergency room, severely beaten and barely conscious, with a 2-year-old daughter named Sophie that no one in the system had known existed. Elena was currently in intensive care with uncertain prognosis, and Sophie was in temporary foster care, but Elena had apparently spent her few conscious moments begging the hospital staff to find her sister Marina, to make sure Sophie didn't end up lost in the system like Elena herself had been as a child. Marina's hand trembled so violently that coffee sloshed over the rim of her cup, burning her fingers, but she barely felt it. Alexander gently took the cup from her hand while she listened to Patricia explain that Elena had listed Marina as her emergency contact years ago and never updated it, that the courts would need to determine temporary guardianship for Sophie while Elena recovered, that Marina had the first right of refusal as the child's closest living relative. When Marina hung up the phone, she stood frozen in the center of her beautiful studio, surrounded by evidence of how far she had come, suddenly facing a decision that could jeopardize everything. Alexander asked what was wrong, and Marina found herself telling him about Elena, about their childhood in foster care, about the sister who had been her only family until addiction and bad relationships had torn them apart. She told him about the guilt she had carried for years, wondering if walking away had been the right choice or the cowardly one, if she could have saved Elena if she had tried harder, if she had stayed despite the pain of watching someone you love destroy themselves. And now Elena's daughter, a child Marina had never met, was sitting in a foster home somewhere, scared and alone, waiting for someone to claim her. Alexander listened as he always did, without judgment or immediate solutions, giving Marina space to process the impossible situation before gently asking what she wanted to do.